Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for January 19th, 2024. It's Friday, so I'm going to be taking your questions, and most of the questions revolved around this dangerous situation in Southwest Asia. But I'm going to start with one that has to do with the Ukraine, that comes from Dan in Canada, who asked, why is Prime Minister Trudeau continuing to push for war in Ukraine? And he said, I understand why Freeland, the deputy prime minister, is doing that because of her connection to the Ukrainian Nazis. But why is Trudeau? Well, I think we have to start with a statement Lyndon LaRouche once said, which he attributed to a contact of his in Russia, who said, never underestimate the factor of insanity in history. And delusion can be a form of insanity. Now, some people are just corrupt, and in the case of Trudeau, that may be the problem, that he's just corrupt. But it's clear there's a delusion among the establishment in foreign policy and military affairs, in finance and economics, that Russia could be beaten, that Russia could be broken apart, there could be regime change. And this is related to the delusion that somehow Putin is intending to reconstitute Stalin's Soviet Empire or the empire of Peter the Great. And so when you're looking at the Ukraine situation, you have to realize that this is a delusion which has been proven to be completely absurd. The idea that there could be regime change in Russia, when in fact Russia is doing remarkably well considering the circumstances of a war and sanctions. But this is a delusion that Russia could be defeated by Ukraine, that sanctions would undermine the economy and isolate Russia. Well, the reality is that delusion has led to a continuing war and a commitment to continue the war no matter how many Ukrainians die. Now, this is shared by leadership in NATO, former NATO figures like General Ben Hodges, former U.S. commanders like David Petraeus, who is also a CIA director, U.S. congressmen like the pathetic Senator Lindsey Graham. But some who push this are not just delusional, they're psychopathic megalomaniacs. And they believe in the fight to break up Russia because of their commitment to the idea of the Unipolar Order, that the U.S. has deserved the right to dictate terms to the rest of the world. And they're also doing it out of greed, that they want the raw materials, they want no rivals, they want to be able to continue to run a global economy that's protected by U.S. and NATO military power. So the idea of breaking up Russia, which is a special project of Chatham House and their propagandist Keir Giles, who's written 2 books about how Putin can't be trusted, Russia wants to be an empire, and it's the duty of the West to protect democracy from Russia. So you want to look at delusions, just go to the Chatham House website or the Atlantic Council website, or listen to people like Sunak and Biden and Ursula von der Leyen. Now, the second question, and there were several people who asked this, why is Netanyahu still the prime minister? Now, some of this has to do with the national trauma in Israel. Polls show that up to 80% of the population wants Netanyahu gone, but after the war. Now, the attack on October 7th shattered the myth that Israel had a defense capability, including the Iron Dome, the intelligence services, and the Israel Defense Forces, that would be invulnerable to any attack by Hamas. Well, that was proven to be false. And for whatever reason why, this has caused a commitment among most Israelis to support the idea of breaking up Hamas. But the question then on Netanyahu goes much further. And by the way, for those of you who are trolls who have been posting that my comments are anti-Semitic, if I say that Netanyahu needs to go, and that's anti-Semitic, then about 80% of the Israeli population is anti-Semitic. The issue of whether it's anti-Semitic to oppose genocide is a completely phony question. And the people who are writing that obviously have another intention, which is to protect the position of Israel as the dominant force in the region and committing the United States to supporting that militarily. But let's go to the question of Netanyahu. He announced yesterday that he's opposed to the idea of a Palestinian state. And he said the reason for that is that a Palestinian state would be a launching pad for attacks on Israel. Then this was backed up by President Herzog, who said at Davos that no Israeli wants peace without the destruction of Hamas. Now, this is a delusion. The idea that you can create peace with an occupied population that's been oppressed for many, many years by destroying those who are fighting the occupation. It ignores history, but more importantly, it's designed to continue the importance of the military financial complex as the force in the world that has control. Now, there's only one way to have peace in the Middle East, and that was what was laid out by Lyndon LaRouche with his Oasis Plan. You need to create a mutual capability that is in the interests of both the Palestinian Arabs and the Israelis to have peace. That's what the Oasis Plan was, the idea that you construct two new canals from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and to the Dead Sea, and that you line those canals with nuclear plants that will desalinate water, that will provide enough water to green the desert. And that in addition to that, you use the power for an industrialization to create a capability for the Palestinian economy to survive without being a source of slave labor to Israel. Now, LaRouche's plan was adopted by Rabin and Arafat, not in terms of LaRouche's plan, but that was the underlying principle of the Oslo Accord and its economic annexes. And had that been followed, we would now be in probably a second decade of peace between Palestinian state and the state of Israel. Instead, who sabotaged it? It was sabotaged directly by Netanyahu, who brags about it, but it was Netanyahu backed by the neocons in the United States like Paul Wolfowitz. Wolfowitz was attacking the idea of nuclear desalination going back to the early 1970s in his PhD thesis. So peace cannot be achieved by military force or by destroying an enemy, because as you try to destroy the enemy, you create new enemies. Peace depends on providing a mutual benefit for the conflicting sides. And that's the idea from LaRouche. And by doing that, you create a capability for increased wealth production that will take care of the needs of all people. So I think the people who are arguing that, like Herzog, like Netanyahu, that there's a permanent state of war between the Palestinians who are asking and demanding their freedom, their sovereignty, and the grouping in Israel which wishes to deny that. If you believe that that's a permanent conflict and there's no way to overcome it, then you're going to have a permanent war. And that's what we're seeing. And again, these are delusions, the delusion of military power, that might makes right, and so on. Now, the third question I want to take up, someone asks, what is the Blinken Plan, which is this idea that the Saudis and several other Arab states will reconstruct Gaza after the war if Israel will end the war. Now, supposedly Blinken presented that to Netanyahu, who basically rejected it, because Netanyahu doesn't want Gaza rebuilt. He doesn't want a Palestinian state, or if Gaza is rebuilt, it will be rebuilt as a settlement territory for Israel. Now, Blinken's delusion was on display at Davos this week. I mentioned it yesterday, but there was more. He continued. Yesterday, he asserted that the U.S. is supported by, quote, virtually every country. Let me continue his quote. Every other country. They want the U.S. They want us present. They want us at the table. They want us leading, unquote. And he gave the example of the U.S. role in promoting climate technology. Now, in saying this, Blinken is merely repeating the mantra that was put forward by Madeleine Albright, that the U.S. is the indispensable nation, that everyone requires the U.S. both because of its economic power, but also its military power to keep everyone in line. That's the unipolar order. That's what Blinken calls the rules-based order, which has nothing to do with any agreed-upon set of rules, and only the enforcement of the economic model of the predators of the military, financial, industrial complex in the West. And that's what Blinken's talking about. When he says they want us at the table, maybe it's to pay the bill when the waiter comes to collect. And the American taxpayers pick that up. But most of the world is turning away from the United States and Western Europe. Not because they want to, but because the US and Western Europe and the United Kingdom is committed to sustaining a unipolar order, which is a neocolonial order that goes against their interests. So it's clear that Blinken has adopted fully the policy of his mentor Albright of the United States as the, quote, indispensable nation. And what reality shows, which delusional people block out, is that most of the world is turning away from that, and the U.S. is becoming increasingly isolated, as we've seen in several UN votes recently. Now, this comes back to the question of, well, what will work for the Southwest Asia? And that's this whole question of LaRouche's Oasis Plan. The idea of statecraft is that you seek a compromise that's in the benefit of both nations involved in the conflict. And this is how the Peace of Westphalia worked. The idea that sovereign nations would not intervene against other nations in their internal affairs, but would act in such a way as to provide a benefit to the other nation. That you actually start statecraft with the principle of what is it that we have in common. As John F. Kennedy spoke in his famous June 1963 speech about looking for common interests with the Soviet Union, immediately within less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's what statecraft is all about. Now, the element of statecraft which makes it work is physical economy. And LaRouche was a physical economist. That is, he insisted that you don't make money from money, but you have a credit system which ensures that you have an allocation of resources that goes into the improvement of the physical production of goods, especially capital goods, heavy industry, with an emphasis on science and technology, which is the basis of productivity increases, which is how you cover the costs of the credit that was generated to do that. This is the Hamiltonian system. LaRouche has written about this extensively. There's a whole library, the LaRouche Legacy Library, that's reproducing his works so people can read this. But whether you have had an opportunity or not yet to discover this from LaRouche, look at what's happening in the world. Look at what the BRICS are doing. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative. Look at the agreements that are going on to establish trade based on national currencies outside of the control of the dollar. And the reason for that is that the dollar is controlled by the geopoliticians who have weaponized it as a force for promoting and sustaining what is literally neocolonial capitalism, predatory capitalism. And if you want a face for that, think of Larry Fink at BlackRock. Think about Vanguard, State Street Capital, Silicon Valley, the collection of military, industrial, financial companies that support the idea of permanent war for the sake of permanent looting. And LaRouche's policy is give every nation the opportunity to develop their land, their raw materials for the benefit of their population. And they'll conclude at a certain point that trade is an essential component of that. It's not that you wall off a country from the rest of the world, but that you make sure that country has a credit system that will fund the producers of that nation. And then you turn the raw materials into something of wealth beyond the idea of the scarcity of the raw material being a source of wealth, as the gold bugs believe, but that in fact the source of wealth is human creativity applied through a productive process. And that's why the Oasis Plan would work. Without that, what do you have? You have a force of arms. And with a force of arms, even if you don't necessarily use the weapons, but if you keep the other nation under the control of your credit system, you've essentially enslaved them. And slaves, the idea of the happy slave is a mythology produced by the slave owners. And that's what we see with the oligarchy today. They treat most of the people of the world as would-be slaves. That's what the whole Davos World Economic Forum plan is. And so when you look at this factor of delusion, what you have to conclude is that it is a delusion that you can make people happy by controlling them. And the way you do that is control their minds through the media cartel and educational brainwashing. So I think the important point here is we've got to snap people out of the delusion that somehow we can continue or go back to a normalcy that existed before COVID. We need to move to a new security and development architecture. Nothing else will bring peace to the planet. So thanks for joining me this week. Share this video, sign up to be a member of the LaRouche organization, the Schiller Institute, a subscriber to the Executive Intelligence Review, which is where a lot of the intelligence that I present comes from. And I think if you do that, you'll have a happy 2024. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.